So in this video, we are looking at stressors, which are the causes of stress. So difficulties that cause worry or emotional tension, stimuli that are triggering our stress response. Now, usually if I ask, what are some examples of things that cause stress? I hear a lot of school, money, work, kids, family, things outside of oneself. So external stresses. But stresses can also be internal. They don't just have to be outside of ourselves. They can be the way we think about things that can cause stress. And this brings us back to that cognitive appraisal theory that our stress is not in response to the situation itself. It's the judgment we make about the situation. But sometimes those judgments are imaginary. Again, this comes back to sometimes those threats are perceived. They're not real, but we think that they are. So, for example, relationships can be a cause of stress. Maybe you've just started dating someone and you're worried about whether or not they like you or not, or what they're thinking, and in reality you don't know, but you've got this internal talk where you're not sure and you're doubting yourself and you're worrying, and that might make you feel stressed. Or maybe you're in a relationship and you are worried that they're cheating on you. In reality they might not be, but your thoughts that they might be are going to make you feel stressed. So it really comes down to how you think about and perceive the world and the things around you. Sometimes there really is no threat, but the way you think about it makes it seem like a real threat. And so that's what we mean when we say perceived threat or challenge. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. Simply believing that something is enough to cause the stress response. Now, the other thing that I notice when I ask people, what are some examples of things that cause you stress? They're usually negative examples, meaning they are stresses that lead to bad stress, or what is technically called distress. So, for example, money problems are usually a bad type of stress. Feeling like you're under a lot of pressure at work, or if you're doing poorly in your classes and that's causing stress. These are typically bad stress experiences. It's the kind of stress that causes people to feel burned out, and that's something we're going to talk about in another video. But feeling very fatigued and exhausted, it's the kind of stress that might cause your performance to start to decline. So maybe your grades start getting worse because you're feeling so stressed about school you can't focus, or maybe your job your work starts to decline. Again, similar reason, you're feeling so stressed and exhausted that you just can't put the same energy into your job that you previously did. So quite often that's the type of stress that we think about, but there is also something called eustress, which is good stress. So this is the kind of stress that you're still stressed, but it's caused by positive things in your life. So for example, having a baby, getting married, planning a vacation. It's a lot of stress goes into these things. A lot of stress goes into planning these things, but at the same time, for a lot of people, it will be positive stress, meaning it's the kind of stress that feels a little different. It's a little lighter. It motivates you to do things that are in your best interests. You feel a little bit more energized. So, for example, obviously I've been planning a wedding over the past year, and it is extremely stressful. There is so much that goes into it, and there are so many moments where I've just wanted to pull my hair out. So I'm still experiencing stress, but it's not bad stress. I know that there's something positive at the end of it, so that keeps me motivated. It helps me feel more positive about the stress, versus something that I feel that has no. What do I want to say here? Versus the bad stress where there aren't always positive outcomes associated with it. You don't have something to look forward to connected to that stress. Planning a vacation, it can be stressful, but you know that you have that vacation to look forward to at the end, and that changes that experience of stress. So basically the point here is that any kind of life-changing event, whether it's good, whether it's bad, it can produce some amount of stress. And this is actually an idea that was first proposed by Holmes and Rahe, who we will look at on the next slide in a bit more detail. But basically, they said that any life-changing event would cause a stress reaction. So before I talk a little bit more about Holmes and Rahe, I want to talk about how we classify stresses, because they can be classified into these different types, primarily chronic versus acute stresses. So chronic stresses are events that persist over an extended period of time. So for example, long-term unemployment. If that continues over a long time, that is considered a chronic stressor, the stress associated with that. Or if you have ongoing money problems, if those money problems are persisting over time, it's a chronic stressor. It's ongoing. We then have our acute stressors. So brief events that sometimes continue to be overwhelming long after the event. So the main example for this, or the main type of acute stressor you usually see, are traumatic events. So this includes things like terrorist attacks, natural disasters. It would also include any kind of exposure to military combat, so going to war, any kind of threatened or actual assault, so whether that's a physical assault, a sexual assault, childhood abuse, and again, that might not be physical or sexual, it could also be emotional abuse. Car accidents would be another example of a traumatic event. So the idea is that, even though that event is over quickly, the stress that it causes continues long after that. The stress response you have continues over time. And an example of this, or an extreme example of this that some people experience, is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So this is a chronic stress reaction. Even though it was an acute stressor that caused it, is a chronic stress reaction. It's ongoing, and it includes usually very intrusive and painful memories. So for example, it might be their involuntary memories they don't want to be having, that they can't seem to push out of their mind. They're experiencing distressing dreams. They may experience flashbacks, which are, these very vivid memories of the events where they feel like they're reliving it. It can also lead to, or a common symptom is very negative thoughts and feelings. So things like anxiety, depression are very common. Other negative emotional states, such as feeling more angry, maybe feeling more irritable. These are just some of the, I could go on and on about the symptoms, and I don't want that to be the focus of this, but the main things to take away from that with PTSD are, these intrusive memories they don't want, and they keep persisting, and this negative emotional response. It's basically like they are constantly in this high state of alert, looking out for any potential threats, not necessarily consciously, but their brain is responding in that way, that they're always in a state of threat. And so you see this ongoing stress response, even though there's no external stressor, you see them responding that way. We then have our life changes. So this brings me back to Holmes and Rahe, who said, any life-changing event would cause a stress reaction. But what they also suggested is that these events can build up. So the more life-changing events you experience within a period of time, the more stress you will feel. So basically the idea is, within a given year, the number of life changes you've had is meant to be a predictor of, how stressed you will be, and of your overall health and well-being. Now imagine I give you a rock to put in your bag and carry around. If I give you one rock, not a big deal, probably barely even going to notice it, not a problem. But if I continue to increase the amount of rocks you have to carry around, eventually it is going to be too heavy and you would be unable to walk. And that's essentially what Holmes and Rahe's theory is suggesting, If too many stressors arise in your life, eventually you can't handle them all. Your body kind of starts to shut down, and you'll notice that people tend to get sick, which we'll talk about in another video, or experience more of more stress in their life as the amount of stressors increases. So life changes are thought to be one predictor for your overall well-being. However, a bigger predictor, according to research, a bigger predictor of your physical and psychological health are daily hassles. Okay, so these are the minor irritations, those little annoyances that are part of our everyday lives. So having a really long to-do list, having to work with people you don't really like, or getting stuck in traffic. These little things we're dealing with every day, and maybe it's not causing a lot of stress, it's just these little irritating things, but that builds up, and that can leave us feeling stressed. Maybe in the moment it's just a little bit of irritation, a slightly negative mood state, but over time, the more daily hassles you're dealing with, the more stressed you are going to feel. And as I mentioned, research actually shows that that is a much bigger predictor of your well-being than life changes. So remember that we are taking a response-driven approach to understanding or to defining stress. So stress is how we respond to those stresses. And that can show up stress can show up in a number of different ways. We can respond in a number of different ways. So here we're not talking about how you respond to stress. Okay, that's coping with stress. Here we're talking about your actual stress response. So your response to stresses. Now, the reason I really want to focus on this in particular is because sometimes people are not even aware of how stressed they are, because we tend to attribute our responses to other things. We're having a stress response, but we don't know that it's a stress response, and we say, oh, I'm getting sick, or oh, I've got this chest pain, maybe something's wrong, or no, maybe that's the result of stress, but we don't always think of it that way. So the first step to being able to reduce the amount of stress in our life is being able to notice when stresses are affecting us, so that we know what they are and what needs to change. It's about being able to notice the subtle ways that our bodies and our minds are responding to that stressor. And there are various ways that this response might show up. So first of all, we might notice the physiological aspects of stress, such as our fight or flight response. So our heart rate increases, our pupils dilate, or expand, we might start sweating, breathing rate increases. It could also include things like headaches, gastrointestinal problems. So maybe you're noticing problems with your digestion, or it could be you're noticing, a lack of appetite or increased appetite. Maybe you are having problems sleeping. Maybe you start to notice yourself getting sick. Maybe you're starting to get a cold or something. For me, when I get overly stressed, for some reason, I get bronchitis. It usually happens at least once a year. And it's usually when I'm very overly stressed. So sometimes people do just think they're sick when they're sick because they're stressed, or maybe they're not actually sick, but these symptoms are a symptom of stress. So first of all, it's about paying attention to what's physically going on. And then we have the cognitive changes. So, for example, when you're feeling stressed, maybe you have a harder time concentrating or focusing. I think that's something I imagine a lot of people are experiencing right now during this pandemic. You're in a state of stress, and it's very hard to focus on things. You might notice that you are more indecisive. You're having a hard time making decisions. Maybe you're having a harder time thinking logically, and problem solving. Maybe you notice the types of thoughts you have change. So maybe you usually think more positively. Maybe you notice that your thoughts are a little bit more negative. Maybe you notice that you start to ruminate more, so you get kind of trapped on a thought and you're going over and over it again. So these are all cognitive changes. Then there's the emotional response. This is the one I'd say people usually most aware of when they're stressed is what they emotionally are feeling. So for me, I tend to notice that when I'm stressed, I feel very overwhelmed. I might feel exhausted. I tend to get a little bit more irritable or frustrated by things. So all of the emotions that you feel when you're stressed. And then lastly, we have the behavioral response. So again, we're not talking about your decision to use coping mechanisms like meditation or yoga and things like that. We're talking about your kind of unconscious behavioral response to stresses. So for example, you might notice that you are eating more. You might notice that you're eating less. If you smoke, you might notice that you're getting cravings to smoke more, and or the amount that you're smoking is increasing. Maybe you notice that you're drinking more. What else? Maybe you notice that you're sleeping more. I'd say I do that a lot more when I'm feeling stressed. So what changes are occurring behaviorally? That's what you're looking for, because that can then indicate that you're stressed, that there is a stressor in your life. Maybe you notice that you're procrastinating a lot more than usual. That could be an indicator that there is a lot of stress in your life. Maybe you are alienating yourself from friends. You don't have the desire to go out so much and socialize. That maybe it's because you're feeling stressed. So looking at those behavioral changes. Now, some of these you may be very sure of. You may be asking me, yeah, when I'm feeling stressed, these are the emotions I feel, or this is behaviorally how I respond, or I know I definitely get headaches or have a hard time sleeping. But quite often it takes a little bit of really paying attention to what's going on internally to really figure out what is your stress response. That's why this week for your in-class discussion, I want you to spend some time thinking about this, asking yourself, what happens in my body when I'm stressed? What changes happen in my mind? What do I feel? How do I behaviorally respond? So that is what you can start thinking about in order to complete this week's discussion.